In this third and final part of our lecture on spinal cord injury, we're going to go over sexual function and bowel and bladder control. Everybody gets very nervous about these particular topics, and they are rather complicated, but we're going to try and keep it fairly simple. We're not going to go into all the different controlling mechanisms involved from your brain and your brainstem and your spinal cord and peripheral nervous system. I'm going to try and keep it rather simple so that you have a general understanding of what you might expect. Let's first talk about sexuality and talking about more the physical part of sexuality. Erections are important for normal sexual intercourse, and men are more likely than women to experience a spinal cord injury. And one of the things that men will be concerned about is their ability to have sexual intercourse and to have erections. If we have a complete lesion, we can somewhat predict the likelihood of experiencing erections. It's much more difficult to predict in the case of incomplete lesions. And we'll talk a little bit more about that. But first, let's talk about what we need in order for there to be an erection, for a gentleman to have an erection. And this is, women actually have erections too, of the clitoris. So this would be true there. But women don't have to have that in order to have successful sexual intercourse, whereas men do. So we're going to be focusing on the male when we're talking about the erection. So there are two types of erection that are necessary for normal erectile function. There's the reflex erection, which is a spinal cord reflex, and then there is psychogenic erection. Psychogenic erection is an erection that is generated by the psyche, by the brain. So in one case, we're dealing with localized spinal cord activity, and in the other case, we're dealing with signals from the brain having to travel down the brainstem, in through the spinal cord, and get down in order to affect the neurons to the penis. So our reflex erection requires us to have active parasympathetic activity at S2, 3, and 4, and to have pudendal nerve activation to our urogenital triangle in particular. Our parasympathetic nervous system, the pelvic splanchnic nerve, activation of that causes vasodilation of the blood vessels of the penis. The pudendal nerve causes contraction of the urogenital triangle, and these muscles, the bulbospongiosus and ischiocavernosus muscles, when they contract, they're wrapping around the penis, and so they essentially compress the penis, which compresses the veins. The large veins of the penis are located superficially, so when the muscles contract, they compress those veins. That prevents blood flow coming into these dilated arteries from being able to get out of the penis, and that's what causes the erection to take place. That's what causes the stiffening of the penis. This reflex erection requires that S2, 3, and 4 be intact, because that's the level that both our parasympathetics are located at and our pudendal nerve neurons are located at. So if that is damaged, if S2, 3, 4 is damaged, and we lose our parasympathetics and pudendal nerve, then this person cannot have a reflex erection because our lower motor neurons are gone. If the injury is above the level of S2, 3, 4, now we have the potential of experiencing a reflex erection because our lower motor neurons and our sensory afferents are intact. So our reflex arc is intact. Excuse me, and everything we need from the muscles is intact. If the injury is at above the level of L1, so somewhere around L1 or higher, this person is likely then to have an intact reflex erection. This reflex is likely to be stronger if we are at a point where the injury is above the level of T6. For some reason, between L1 and S2, we do not see reflex erections take place. The lower motor neurons are intact. It does not require upper motor neuron activation, but yet they do not get a reflex erection. And we do not understand why that is, so I cannot explain that. Just recognize that if there's damage at S2, 3, 4, we have a lower motor neuron injury, so our reflex is going to be gone. If the injury is above L1, this person is probably going to be able to have a reflex erection, and it's going to get much stronger if the injury is above T6. If we have a complete lesion or a very large incomplete lesion, like an anterior cord that has taken out all of the lateral cortical spinal tract and all of our other descending tracts, we're probably going to have hyperreflexia. This is the same thing that would occur in our skeletal muscles. If the upper motor neurons that are helping to control the reflexes are damaged, so they cannot control reflexes, the reflexes are exaggerated, they're hyperactive because there's nothing to dampen them. And so we will see the same thing happen when it comes to sexual functioning bowel and bladder reflexes. If the upper motor neurons are damaged, we can't control the reflexes, they're going to be hyperactive. Right? So again, if our injury is above L1, so that our lower motor neurons are intact, but our upper motor neurons are damaged, we're going to see this hyperreflexia. If the incomplete lesion is small or doesn't affect the upper motor neurons that help to control the lower motor neuron reflex, then we're probably going to see what I will call a functional reflex. I'm not going to say it's normal because it might not be normal, but it's probably not going to be this exaggerated hyperreflexive kind of reflex. So it's going to be more functional for this patient. It's not going to happen when they don't want it to, kind of a thing, to any great extent. So if there are large areas of white matter intact, probably going to be okay with function. Large areas of white matter damaged, we're probably going to have this hyperreflexia response. Again, with incomplete lesions, it can be difficult to predict because the amount of white matter damage can vary. But when you're thinking of like our syndromes, for instance, cervical central cord syndrome, oftentimes we have functional erection. Hemisection, we typically have functional erection. Even though half of the spinal cord, all that white matter is damaged. When we're talking about bowel, bladder, and sexual function, a lot of this control comes bilaterally. So if at least half the spinal cord is working, usually they have pretty decent control. But if we're talking something like a complete lesion or an anterior cord, now we don't have enough descending control. And we're more likely to see non-functional hyperreflexive kind of responses. For the psychogenic erection, again, this requires cortical processing. So you see your spouse and you find that to your spouse sexually attractive. You see, let's say the most recent Sports Illustrated swimsuit edition cover. My goodness, that was something. Whatever, something that you generate in your cortex, which then sends descending input into the lower thoracic and upper lumbar spinal cord. In order for us to have psychogenic erection, we have to have our intact parasympathetic and pudendal nerves, because we need to have the blood flow be allowed to change. But we also need to be able to get that information down from the brain. So again, if we have small lesions with large areas of white matter intact, psychogenic erection is likely to be functional. If there's a complete lesion, or if the majority of the white matter tracts above the level of about T10, somewhere in there, have been damaged, then the ability to have a psychogenic erection is unlikely. If the damage is in the low thoracic, upper lumbar regions, again, it's harder to say. It's less likely that you could predict what might happen regarding the psychogenic erection. All depends on the exact level and the degree of damage. So for normal sexual functioning, you do need, or for normal development and maintenance of erection, you do need both of these kinds of erections to take place. A couple other things to just mention regarding sexuality. In men, if they are able to ejaculate, and we're not going to go into the physiology of the ejaculation, but if they are able to ejaculate, the semen may end up going retrograde, which means instead of exiting out the urethra, it goes backwards up into the bladder. And this would occur if they have paralysis of the bladder sphincters. Also, we do see that the longer somebody, the longer the duration has been from the injury point, the lower production of sperm and the less motility within the, of those sperm, so that the longer out from the injury, the less fertile the gentleman becomes. We don't necessarily see that so much with females regarding fertility. So females are still able to get pregnant after a spinal cord injury, and women need to be instructed on using contraceptives if they're going to have sexual intercourse and they do not wish to become pregnant. Now moving on to bladder and bowel function, I'm going to first talk about a healthy individual. What happens? Again, we have reflexive control, and this is how a bladder and bowel work in a baby, until they're potty trained. So you get stretch of the bladder. This stimulates sensory neurons in the bladder, which their primary afferents go into the spinal cord at S2, 3, and 4. This stimulates a reflex called the sacral micturition reflex when it comes to the bladder. The micturition means to pee, essentially. So the sacral micturition reflex center is just where the nerves are located that are involved in the reflex, that then causes your bladder to contract by stimulating the parasympathetic nervous system, your pelvic splanchnic nerve, and also inhibiting the motor nerves to the pudendal nerve, because we want our external sphincter to relax. So we don't want the pelvic floor contracting. So we inhibit the pudendal nerve to make sure our urogenital diaphragm and our urogenital triangle, or in the case of bowel, the anal sphincter relaxes, the external anal sphincter. We stimulate the parasympathetic nerves because they inhibit the internal sphincters and they cause contraction of the bladder and the bowel. When we get relaxation of the sphincters and contraction of the bladder or the bowel, this causes voiding or defecation. Okay. Simultaneous to this occurring at the level of the sacral spinal cord, we also get some information of the sensory stretching of the bladder that goes up to the spinal cord to the sympathetic nervous system to inhibit it. Because the sympathetic nervous system, when we're at rest, helps to actually keep the bladder and bowel relaxed. And so we want to get rid of that inhibition of the bladder and bowel, and we want to encourage the contraction of the bladder and bowel, and we need to make sure we're not contracting our sphincters. So this all occurs at the same time. Most of it occurring directly in the sacral spinal cord, S2, 3, 4, but the sympathetic component would be more in the low thoracic, upper lumbar levels. So we inhibit sympathetic, activate parasympathetic, inhibit the somatic system. But eventually we develop voluntary control. So what happens here? Well, first of all, an area in your brain is very important for having overall control of bowel and bladder. And this area of your brain now becomes myelinated. So it's now maturing sufficiently that it can exert control over the system. Another thing is that you start to develop a sense of social acceptability. Is it okay? Is it not okay? So these things all combine, and typically somewhere between the age of 1 and 3, with boys usually taking longer because it takes longer for their brain to mature. This tension that occurs in the bladder or bowel as they fill ascends bilaterally up the spinal cord to get to two places. One is a place in your pons. It's called the pontine micturition center. So we have the sacral micturition center. So that's telling us, oh, these are the nerves in the sacral spinal cord. The pontine micturition center affects the bladder and is located in the pons. The pontine micturition center facilitates the sacral center. So it wants you to pee and it wants you to poop, but the micturition center is associated with peeing. So it facilitates the reflex center to activate our parasympathetics, and it inhibits the sympathetic neurons and the alpha motor neurons in our pudendal nerve. So it helps this whole process to take place. The prefrontal cortex, along with some other areas, inhibit the pontine micturition center and activate the pudendal nerve via corticospinal tracts. So it stimulates your motor cortex to activate the lateral corticospinal tracts, and in order for us to be contracting the muscles of the external sphincters, to contract the muscles of the pelvic floor, while helping to relax the bladder and the bowel itself. Once you know, okay, I'm in the bathroom, I'm on the toilet, now's an appropriate time to go, then your prefrontal cortex area shuts off, no longer inhibits the pontine micturition center. So the pontine micturition center is disinhibited, which allows it to go ahead and activate the sacrospinal cord and inhibit the sympathetic neurons and the somatic neurons. We do have other regions in the cortex that stimulate the pontine micturition center. And it's a balance between these different parts of your brain that determine whether or not your bladder and bowel are going to empty or not. If that balance shifts towards the centers that excite the pontine micturition center, such as if you're startled or if you're afraid or really nervous, then the balance being shifted more towards excitation of that center will cause it to override any awareness you might have of being in a socially inappropriate time and place, and can result in undesirable emptying. So what happens when we have a spinal cord injury? This is, again, very similar to what we talked about with the reflex erection and our deep tendon reflex in our other muscles. If the injury is at the sacral spinal cord, where the parasympathetic nerves that cause contraction and where the reflexes are located, if those are damaged, if we have lower motor neuron damage, then we're going to have a flaccid, paralyzed bladder and bowel. This leads to overdistension, which can lead to overflow incontinence. They're not able to empty. Eventually, there's just so much in the bowel or the bladder that it starts to leak out, and bowel impaction. And this persists beyond the spinal shock period. This is long term. If we have a complete injury above the level of S2, we now have an upper motor neuron injury, and we're going to see hyperreflexia. So we're going to have a spastic neurogenic bladder or bowel. We're going to see reflex emptying. So the bladder starts to fill or the bowel starts to fill, and then we get this reflex contraction response. We can have, though, simultaneously hypertonia and hyperreflexia of the external sphincters. This can act as an obstruction. So the bladder's contracting, but the sphincter's contracting, so the urine can't get out. So there can be an obstruction problem as well. An incomplete lesion, again, it can be very difficult to predict what's going to happen, but similar to our reflex erection, if we have a large area of white matter tracts intact, we're likely to have a very functional bowel and bladder. If, on the other hand, there's very little white matter that is intact, we're probably going to have this hyperreflexive bladder and bowel. So talking about lesions that are above the level of S2, 3, 4, it can be difficult to predict. But again, if you have something like a complete lesion or an anterior cord injury, you're probably going to have a hyperreflexive spastic neurogenic bladder and bowel. if you have an injury that's more like a central cord or a hemisection, you're more likely to have a functional return of bowel and bladder control.